Today, we're tackling something huge: addiction and recovery in the digital age. I mean, the internet has just completely changed the game for how we access information, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's like this vast, almost infinite library of human experience,
Yeah.
instantly available. And for complex issues, really tough ones like addiction, it's created this incredible space.
A space for learning, connection, maybe even reducing some of that stigma.
Exactly. You've got, peer-reviewed lectures from top neuroscientists sitting right alongside raw, personal stories from people deep in the struggle or celebrating years of recovery. It's quite unique.
But there's a flip side, isn't there? A paradox.
There really is. That's the critical part. The very platform offering solutions, evidence-based help, it can also be a source of harm.
Or even become the addiction itself.
Well, think about how these platforms are designed. The recommendation algorithms, they're incredibly powerful. They feed you content, keep you watching.
Autoplay, endless scrolling.
Right. It's all engineered for maximum engagement, keeping you on the platform longer. And when that crosses a line,
It starts looking like other addictions.
Yeah.
Neglecting work, family, your own well-being.
that's exactly it. It mirrors those same destructive patterns. So the digital space is, well, it's both a potential problem and a potential solution.
Which means we have to be mindful about how we use it. Intentional.
Definitely. Mindful consumption, critical awareness, that's the starting point if you want to actually harness the good stuff without falling into the traps.
So our mission today then is to kind of chart a course through all this.
Yeah, to cut through the noise. There's so much out there, and we need to separate the genuine insight from the spectacle, the misinformation.
Because high view counts don't always mean high quality.
Not at all. Sometimes, unfortunately, high views signal sensationalism, content that exploits suffering for clicks.
You mentioned those awful overdose videos.
Exactly. It's horrifying. People filming someone in medical distress instead of helping. That's the extreme, but it highlights the contrast.
Between exploitation and genuine empathetic education.
Right. Our focus has to be on the stuff that actually illuminates the path to healing, that's built on ethical grounds, on evidence, content that fosters real understanding.
Okay, so where do we start this mapping process?
I think we have to begin with the foundational perspectives, the ideas that really shifted how we talk about addiction in the modern era.
Moving away from blame and judgment.
Precisely. Moving out of that shadow of moral failure and into the light of, science and sociology, it's a crucial shift.
For centuries, it really was seen as a character flaw, wasn't it? Weakness of will, bad choices.
Absolutely. And the work of several key thinkers has been instrumental in changing that paradigm, advocating for understanding based on compassion and, actual investigation.
And these ideas resonate, don't they? People seem hungry for a framework that acknowledges the complexity, the humanity of it all.
They do, because these perspectives suggest addiction isn't some inexplicable moral lapse. It's often a response, maybe a logical, though ultimately destructive, response to very real human suffering.
Like what kind of suffering?
Things like unresolved trauma, deep shame, and maybe most fundamentally, disconnection, a lack of belonging.
Which brings us to Johan Hari. His ideas have been pretty revolutionary in this space.
Hugely influential. Hari basically threw down the gauntlet and said, everything you think you know about addiction might be wrong.
He challenges the idea that it's purely about chemical hooks, about the substance itself.
Exactly. He argues it's not primarily a chemical dependency, but fundamentally a disease of isolation, loneliness.
And his core idea, the opposite of addiction is.
Not sobriety, but connection.
That's powerful. Simple, but profound.
It is. And he backs it up with research, like the famous rat park studies and social observations. His point is, when individuals lack healthy human bonds, a sense of purpose, a feeling of belonging, they're far more vulnerable to forming unhealthy bonds with substances or behaviors.
So if you give people, or even rats in the experiment, a rich, connected environment,
the compulsion to use often dramatically decreases. The implication for treatment is massive.
it means just removing the substance isn't enough. You have to build a life.
Exactly. The focus shifts to actively constructing a life filled with meaning, community, genuine engagement. It becomes less about individual willpower and more about societal support and integration.
And Hari connects this to broader issues too, right? Like anxiety and depression.
He does. He argues these modern epidemics stem from the same root: societal disconnection. Our culture, he suggests, often pushes us towards lifestyles that are incompatible with our deep-seated human needs for belonging and security.
So fixing it isn't just about individual therapy, it's about changing society, building communities that foster connection.
That's his argument. A proactive effort to reform institutions and create spaces that nurture belonging, not just expecting individuals to cope alone.
Okay, so Hari gives us the social dimension. Who complements that?
Dr. Gabor Maté brings a crucial psychological and developmental perspective. He's worked extensively with severely addicted populations.
And his take is different.
It complements Hari's, but focuses more on the internal landscape. Maté argues addiction isn't the primary problem, it's a coping mechanism.
An attempt to deal with underlying pain.
Exactly. An attempt to solve a problem of unbearable emotional pain, like a form of self-medication or emotional anesthetic, even if it's ultimately destructive.
And his famous question encapsulates that, doesn't it?
It does. Not why the addiction, but why the pain. That question shifts everything.
What did his clinical work suggest was the source of that pain, usually?
He concluded that unresolved childhood trauma, often unacknowledged, lies at the root of almost every addiction he encountered.
And trauma here isn't just major abuse, right? He has a broader definition.
Critically important point, yes. It includes overt abuse, of course, but also the subtler yet deeply damaging experiences like emotional neglect, chronic insecurity, or the lack of secure attachment during crucial developmental periods.
That reframing has a huge impact on stigma.
Absolutely huge. The person struggling is no longer seen as bad making bad choices, but as wounded, trying to survive deep internal suffering with the tools they have, however destructive those tools may be.
Which calls for compassion and treatment focused on the underlying wound, not just the symptom.
Precisely. Addressing the emotional injury is key.
So we have the social, the psychological. Who else is essential in this foundational thinking?
Brené Brown. While she isn't an addiction specialist per se, her research on shame, vulnerability, and courage has become absolutely fundamental to modern recovery philosophy.
Shame. That feels like a big one in addiction.
It's massive. Her research consistently shows that shame, that intensely painful feeling of being fundamentally unworthy of love and belonging, is a primary driver of addictive behaviors.
It fuels the isolation Hari talks about.
Directly. Shame thrives in secrecy and isolation. It's rooted in that deep fear of disconnection.
And her antidote is vulnerability. That sounds counterintuitive.
It does. But she argues convincingly that vulnerability is the source of true strength. It's the courage to allow yourself to be seen, flaws and all.
That takes immense courage, especially when dealing with the shame of addiction.
It does. And she defines courage beautifully, drawing from the Latin root cor, meaning heart. Courage is to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart.
Wow, that framework seems transformative for recovery.
It really is. It provides the language needed to dismantle shame, to stop hiding, and to build the genuine, authentic connections that are vital for healing.
These modern perspectives are powerful. Do they connect with older wisdom too, traditional recovery ideas?
Absolutely. There's a lot of resonance. Think about the emphasis in many self-development philosophies, like the work of Dr. Wayne Dyer, on letting go of resentments.
Resentments can really hold you back, poison your emotional state.
Exactly. Dyer talked about the idea that there are no justified resentments if you want to grow emotionally. That aligns perfectly with the work needed in recovery, releasing the past to find freedom now.
And principles from programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, they still seem relevant.
Hugely relevant. And they're finding new audiences online. Concepts like surrender, for instance.
Surrender. That can be a tough one for people to grasp.
It can. But speakers like Sandy B articulate it so well, the idea that recovery often begins when you stop trying to control everything, when you finally accept help, whether from a higher power or the support of a community. Letting go.
So bringing all these together, Hari, Maté, Brown, traditional wisdom, it paints a picture of addiction as much more than just a chemical issue.
Definitely. It frames it as fundamentally a relational, emotional, and even spiritual crisis, first and foremost.
Okay, that gives us a really strong foundation in the why. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the how, the science.
Right. Understanding the biology is crucial for combating stigma and offering real hope. How does addiction actually work in the brain and body?
There seems to be a big push from institutions to get this scientific message out there.
There is a really coordinated effort by public health bodies, researchers, using digital platforms to spread a clear, unified message. Addiction is a chronic, treatable brain disorder.
not a moral failing.
Absolutely not a moral failing. And getting that message out is designed specifically to replace fear and misunderstanding with knowledge and hope. It empowers people by shifting focus from blame to biology.
Which institutions are leading this charge?
Well, the National Institute on Drug Abuse and ADIDA is a major player. They're part of the NIH in the U.S.
What kind of information do they provide?
Extensive resources explaining the neurobiology. You often see their director, Dr. Nora Volkow, explaining how drugs essentially hijack the brain's reward pathways.
Hijack, how does that work?
They flood the system with neurochemicals like dopamine, creating intense pleasure or relief, but they also impair the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for judgment, decision-making, impulse control.
Which explains why just choosing to stop is so incredibly hard once addiction takes hold. The brain's circuitry is compromised.
Precisely. And understanding that mechanism is key. Then you have SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration.
What's their focus?
More on the practical side, for people in recovery and their families. They have great resources, like explainers on triggers and cravings.
Triggers and cravings, huge challenges in recovery.
Huge. And SAMHSA's materials translate the neuroscience behind them, why a craving feels so overwhelming, and then offer concrete, evidence-based strategies to manage them.
So these institutions provide a reliable baseline of scientific info for the public.
Exactly. Vetted, trustworthy information.
Beyond the big institutions, what about individual researchers, university experts?
Absolutely vital contributions there too. Dr. Anna Lembke at Stanford is a really important voice.
What's her key concept?
She talks a lot about the pleasure-pain balance in the brain, homeostasis.
The brain trying to keep things stable.
Exactly. It's a fundamental biological drive.
Yeah.
So when you repeatedly flood the brain with intense pleasure from drugs, or even high-reward behaviors like gambling or constant social media,
The brain pushes back.
it does. It tries to compensate. It downregulates its own pleasure receptors to try and regain balance.
And the result is?
What Dr. Lembke calls a dopamine deficit state, a state where it's hard to feel pleasure from normal things. You feel flat, irritable, empty.
So the craving isn't just for the high anymore, it's to escape that deficit state, that pain.
That's the crucial insight. It becomes less about seeking pleasure and more about desperately escaping the pain of that internal deficit. That's what drives the compulsive cycle.
And she calls this the modern plague, especially with digital stuff.
Yeah, she connects it very strongly to our culture's relentless pursuit of instant high-intensity gratification, particularly through digital media.
For people who want to go deeper into the brain chemistry, are there resources for that?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of great animated explainers out there. Channels like TED-Ed or Life Noggin often break down complex neuroscience.
Using visuals to show how substances change neural pathways, rewiring the brain.
Exactly. They illustrate concepts like tolerance, needing more of the substance for the same effect in withdrawal, the physical and psychological agony when the substance is removed, and cravings, that intense psychological pull.
And for really in-depth discussion.
You have platforms featuring dialogues with neuroscientists, like the Huberman Lab podcast, for example. They go into incredible detail.
Like how specific drugs, say ADHD stimulants, affect specific brain circuits, dopamine, norepinephrine.
Precisely that level of detail. Discussing the mechanisms and the risks of misuse. It really bridges the gap between academic journals and a curious public.
Amidst all this talk of brain changes, is there also a message of hope? Can the brain heal?
Absolutely crucial point, yes. The scientific consensus strongly emphasizes neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to change and adapt.
So addiction causes changes, but they aren't necessarily permanent.
That's the key message of hope. The brain isn't irreparably broken. Experts, often citing research from places like Harvard Medical School, talk about the timeline for recovery.
And the evidence shows the brain can recover.
Conclusively, with sustained abstinence and effective treatment, the brain can and does repair itself over time. Executive functions, emotional regulation, they can improve significantly. Addiction is chronic, yes, but manageable and treatable.
Okay, so we've looked inside the brain. Now, you mentioned earlier we need to zoom out, look at the bigger picture, the societal landscape.
Yes, absolutely essential. A full understanding demands looking beyond the individual to the systems and environments where addiction takes root and thrives.
So moving from what's wrong with this person
to what's wrong with the systems producing this suffering. It requires examining things like corporate behavior, government policies, socioeconomic pressures.
The opioid crisis seems like a stark example here.
A devastatingly clear example of corporate greed and regulatory failure colliding. The investigations into companies like Purdue Pharma are chilling.
The deceptive marketing of highly addictive painkillers. knowing the risks.
Knowingly fueling an epidemic for profit. The documentation is extensive and damning, prioritizing profit over human lives.
And the crisis evolved, didn't it? From prescription pills to heroin, and now fentanyl.
A tragic trajectory. Pills became harder to get or too expensive, leading many to heroin. And then came illicitly manufactured fentanyl, cheap, incredibly potent, and flooding the streets. The death toll has been astronomical.
There's content showing the human cost, right? Documentaries.
Yes, powerful documentaries showing the impact on families, the strain on first responders, the overwhelmed healthcare system. Even law enforcement, like the FBI, produced films like Chasing the Dragon, trying to warn young people off that path.
Alongside the critique of corporations, there's also a critique of the government's response, the war on drugs.
A very strong and necessary critique. The consensus among many experts and analysts is that the war on drugs has been a catastrophic failure.
How so? Failed in what way?
By focusing almost exclusively on criminalization and punishment rather than treatment and public health. It's led to mass incarceration, disproportionately harming minority communities and the poor.
Without actually addressing the root causes, like poverty, trauma, lack of opportunity.
Exactly. It hasn't solved the problem, and in many ways, it's created new ones or made existing ones worse. The call now is for a fundamental policy shift.
Toward what?
Towards harm reduction, treatment on demand, decriminalization, and compassion. Reframing addiction definitively as a health issue, not primarily a criminal one. Using resources for healing, not punishment.
You also mentioned an interesting concept, limbic capitalism. What's that about?
It's a really insightful lens for understanding the economic forces at play. It describes economic systems designed to profit from stimulating our primitive brain regions, the limbic system, the parts involved in pleasure, reward, and compulsion.
So industries intentionally designing products to be addictive?
Essentially, yes. Historians and critics trace how industries, pharma, alcohol, tobacco, but also increasingly tech, social media, gaming engineer products to maximize engagement, to be sticky by directly targeting those reward pathways.
Making addiction not an accident, but a predictable outcome of the market.
Often, yes, a predictable, profitable outcome when profit motives consistently override genuine concern for consumer well-being. It connects things that seem different: opioid addiction, gambling, endless scrolling under one economic logic.
It's a sobering perspective. To bring it back to the human level, you mentioned content focusing on community impact.
Yes, and some of the most moving work does this, like that Oscar-nominated short doc about Huntington, West Virginia.
The town called the epicenter of the opioid crisis.
Tragically, yes. It followed 3 women, a fire chief, a judge, a street missionary, fighting the epidemic on the ground.
Putting a face on the statistics.
Exactly. Showing the devastating local impact, the strain on resources, the heartbreak for families, but also the incredible resilience of communities fighting back, trying to heal. It's powerful stuff.
Okay, we've covered the foundations, the science, the societal context. Let's get more specific now about different types of addiction. You said it's not monolithic.
Right. While there are common threads in the brain science and psychology, different substances and behaviors have unique features, risks, and need tailored approaches. And importantly, behavioral addictions are now recognized as serious clinical issues.
Let's start with one of the oldest and most common, alcohol use disorder.
Still a massive global issue. Content ranges from stark documentaries like Louis Theroux's Drinking to Oblivion.
I remember that one, a very raw look inside a hospital unit.
Incredibly raw. Shows the severe physical toll, liver damage, brain damage, and the psychological chaos. Then you have scientific explainers detailing how alcohol impairs cognition, damages organs long-term.
And on the other side, stories of hope, recovery.
Absolutely crucial. Long-term sobriety testimonials, people celebrating 5, 10, 20 years sober, sharing their journeys. It offers tangible proof that recovery is possible and provides immense hope and solidarity.
Next, the opioids, heroin, prescription painkillers, and especially fentanyl. The content here must be vast, given the crisis.
It is. And a lot comes from medical institutions trying to educate and offer hope. Johns Hopkins, for example, shared a story of a woman overcoming a 30-year opioid addiction.
Showing that even long-term severe addiction is treatable.
Exactly. And there's a huge focus on the dangers of fentanyl. Personal stories are vital here to cut through the numbness of statistics, to show the human cost of its lethality.
We also talked about people getting hooked through legitimate prescriptions.
Yes, and there are powerful first-person accounts of that. people sharing how easily dependence started after surgery or injury, highlighting the need for caution even with medical use.
Okay, what about stimulants? Cocaine, meth, but also prescription misuse.
A complex category. You see investigative documentaries showing the community-level devastation of meth, for instance. Very stark.
And the science. How do stimulants differ from opioids or alcohol?
They primarily rev up the system, increasing dopamine, norepinephrine, causing euphoria, energy, but often leading to severe crashes, paranoia, and long-term changes in brain function. The addiction pattern can be intense.
And the prescription stimulant issue. Adderall, Ritalin.
A major growing concern, especially among young adults. Misuse driven by academic pressure or wanting a cognitive edge. Experts warn about the addiction potential and the risk of it leading to other substance issues down the line.
Shifting to behavioral addictions, gambling seems to be exploding.
It really has, largely fueled by the ease of online sports betting, mobile apps. It's everywhere.
And the content reflects this.
Yes, deeply personal stories of financial ruin, broken relationships, the sheer chaos compulsive gambling creates, but also, thankfully, a rise in recovery content.
Practical help. How to stop, manage debt, find support.
Exactly. Step-by-step guides, links to Gamblers Anonymous and other resources. The statistics are alarming problem. Gambling rates doubling in a decade shows a rapidly growing crisis.
And the final category, gaming, internet, social media addiction, the newest frontier.
In many ways, yes. And it's being taken much more seriously now clinically. Experts are applying psychological and neuroscience frameworks to understand problematic gaming, internet use, social media compulsion.
So it's not just kids playing too many video games.
No, it can involve significant depression, social withdrawal, loss of motivation, and a genuine inability to control the behavior, mirroring substance addiction patterns. Documentaries explore this, as well as broader internet compulsions, online dating, endless scrolling.
Validating the feeling many people have of losing control over their digital lives.
Precisely. Framing it as a legitimate addictive process that warrants attention and intervention.
We've covered so much ground, the why, the how, the societal factors, the specifics. Now let's talk about the human element, the stories.
Yes, because ultimately that's what cuts through the theory and the statistics, the lived experiences.
These personal narratives, they do more than just illustrate points, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. They humanize the struggle. They're incredibly powerful tools for dismantling stigma, and they offer undeniable proof that recovery isn't just an abstract possibility, it's happening every day.
And you mentioned they often challenge the simple rock bottom idea.
They do. Recovery journeys are often much more nuanced. It might be a gradual internal crisis, a slow dawning realization, rather than one dramatic event. More relatable, perhaps.
When public figures share their stories, that seems to have a big impact.
Huge. It helps normalize the conversation. Macklemore talking about addiction as driven by trying to fill an internal void, even when he looks successful on the outside.
His lack of joy was apparent to loved ones.
Exactly. Or Dax Shepard's insight. This one really sticks with me, that rock bottom isn't always the catalyst.
What was his catalyst?
He realized that achieving all his external goals career, money left him the unhappiest he'd ever been. A profound confirmation that external success can't fix internal pain. That resonates deeply.
And others too. Russell Brand, Jamie Lee Curtis.
Yes, Jamie Lee Curtis opening up about her opioid addiction, Kurt Sutter and Katie Segal talking about decades of sobriety.
Yeah.
Their willingness to share normalizes recovery as a long-term, ongoing process.
Beyond celebrities, there's content featuring everyday people, sometimes in very difficult circumstances.
Yes, channels that offer raw, unfiltered interviews, sometimes with people still in active addiction living on the margins. It's tough viewing, but offers an unparalleled window into the human reality without the usual sensationalism.
And then stories tracking the journey through recovery.
Those are incredibly powerful. Following someone from chaos and pain through the hard work of getting well, showcasing their resilience, like that story of Deja.
The young woman who promised her dying grandfather she'd get clean.
That's the one. Hours before her arrest, she makes that promise. And she does it. Gets sober, goes to college. It's a potent reminder that transformation is possible, even from the lowest points.
These stories really focus on the after, don't they? The life rebuilt.
Yes, the restored relationships, finding purpose, the simple joys of living free from obsession. Treatment centers often showcase these successes, providing concrete evidence that professional help works.
And what about the families? Addiction impacts them so profoundly.
Absolutely. It's rightly called a family disease. There's crucial content focusing on the family perspective.
The struggle between support and enabling, setting boundaries.
That delicate, painful balance. Testimonials from family members about learning to set firm, loving boundaries, which often feels like the hardest thing to do, are vital. They show how those boundaries can sometimes be life-saving for the person struggling and essential for the family's own survival and healing.
That idea that families can't fix the person but can support recovery while protecting themselves?
Exactly. Supporting recovery, not the addiction itself, and emphasizing the family's own need for healing and support.
Okay, so understanding the problem, hearing the stories, that leads us to the final piece. Action. What can people actually do? Where can they find help?
This is where the digital space really shines, potentially. It's become this ecosystem for practical tools, treatment information, and finding supportive communities, like a new kind of digital mutual aid.
Blending old principles with new platforms.
Exactly. Making help accessible 24/7 in ways it never was before.
You mentioned recovery influencers. What role do they play?
These are often people with lived experience sharing incredibly practical advice. Someone who used heroin sharing how I quit, or 5 tips for early sobriety. It's direct, relatable, actionable.
And professionals are using these platforms too.
Yes, master addiction counselors teaching families intervention strategies, therapists offering guidance on healing self-esteem, navigating social triggers. It's a whole support system online.
But finding actual treatment can be confusing. Does the content help demystify that?
Reputable sources do, explaining the different levels of care, medical detox, inpatient rehab, outpatient programs, making it less intimidating.
And explaining evidence-based treatments, like Meth for opioid addiction.
Crucial, explaining how medications like Suboxone or Methadone work, stabilizing brain chemistry, reducing cravings. This combats the harmful myth that it's just replacing one drug with another. It's medical treatment for a brain disorder.
Beyond just stopping use, what about staying stopped? Long-term recovery skills.
That's key. Content focuses on building a new life, developing coping skills, identifying personal triggers, and having a plan to manage cravings when they hit.
Finding purpose again. That seems important.
Hugely important. Positive psychology research backs this up. Finding meaning and purpose is a major protective factor for long-term sobriety, and the ongoing need for community support networks that's always emphasized.
And support for the families continues to be vital here too.
Absolutely. Resources teaching families how to set those firm, loving boundaries we talked about, ending the enabling cycle.
There was that powerful example, Mom's boundaries saved my life.
Testimonials like that are so validating for families doing incredibly difficult work, reinforcing that they can support recovery while prioritizing their own well-being.
And these digital communities, places like TikTok even, are they becoming part of the support system?
They really are. You see the recovery community using hashtags like #SoberLution, #WeDoRecover, sharing short, authentic, sometimes humorous videos about their journey.
A new form of peer support, reaching younger people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Reduces stigma through authenticity.
Yeah.
But, and this is a crucial caveat, these online communities are supplements, not substitutes, for professional treatment and evidence-based care. They're part of the toolkit, not the whole solution.
Okay. We've covered an immense amount of ground.
I think a few core messages stand out. First, addiction isn't a moral failing. It's often a response to deep pain and disconnection. Second, it's a treatable brain disorder, and science is increasingly showing us how it works and how the brain can heal.
And third, the societal piece.
Right. It's deeply intertwined with systemic issues, flawed policies, corporate practices like limbic capitalism that profit from it. We can't ignore that context.
And running through it all, the power of stories.
Undeniably. The willingness to share truth is perhaps the most potent antidote to the shame and isolation that fuel addiction. These stories validate, connect, and offer profound, tangible hope.
So the future of recovery seems tied to this digital age, for better or worse.
It does. It has this incredible power to break down barriers, share knowledge, build global support communities in ways we couldn't imagine before. But we have to be mindful of its own addictive potential.
Which brings us back to that core idea. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Exactly. And maybe that's the final thought, the challenge for everyone listening.
In an age where technology can so easily isolate us, despite its promise of connection,
How do you personally, intentionally, harness its power not just for information, but to build genuine, real-world connection in your own life, in your community? How do we use these tools to foster understanding and purpose, not just passive consumption?